Poor girl stops a car to escape. Arranged marriage, never expected the driver to be a millionaire. The wind howled through the narrow streets of Willow Ridge, a small forgotten town tucked deep in Louisiana. The flickering streetlights cast long, unsteady shadows, illuminating the modest home of Emily Harper. At just 21 years old, Emily had lived a life defined by struggle, yet she carried herself with a quiet dignity that belied the weight she bore on her slender shoulders. Inside the house, the faint scent of lavender from an old air freshener mixed with the dampness of the creaking wooden floors. Emily sat by the window in the small living room, her face bathed in the pale light of the moon. Her chestnut brown hair, usually tied back in a practical braid, was loose, framing her face. Her almond-shaped hazel eyes, filled with longing and determination, stared out at the world she felt she might never truly be a part of. On the couch behind her sat Margaret Harper, her mother, with her hands folded tightly in her lap. Lines of worry etched deep into Margaret's face, making her look older than her 45 years. She had raised Emily alone after Emily's father passed in a factory accident when she was just a child. For years, Margaret had worked tirelessly as a seamstress, her hands raw and calloused, to provide for her daughter. But now the debts were piling up, and Margaret was out of options. "Emily, this is the only way." Margaret's voice cracked as she spoke. Her words felt as brittle as the dry leaves outside. "Richard can give you the life I never could. He can take care of us of you." Emily turned her gaze from the window, her eyes narrowing. "You mean he can take care of you?" she replied, her tone sharp but not cruel. She regretted the bitterness in her words almost immediately, but the thought of marrying Richard Cross, a man old enough to be her father, made her stomach churn. Margaret flinched but didn't respond. She knew her daughter was right, but the thought of losing their home, of losing everything, terrified her. "It's not just for me," Margaret said quietly. "Richard promised to pay off the mortgage, the medical bills, everything. I can't see another way out." Emily clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. The name Richard Cross was enough to send a cold shiver down her spine. He was a man of means, yes, wealthy, powerful, and respected in Willow Ridge, but beneath the polished exterior was a man who reveled in control. The way he had looked at her during their last meeting made her feel like an object, not a person. "He doesn't love me, Mom," Emily said, her voice softer now but still firm. "He wants a trophy, not a wife, and I won't spend the rest of my life trapped in his world." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the old clock on the mantel. Emily could feel the tension hanging in the air, heavy and suffocating. She didn't blame her mother entirely. Margaret was doing what she thought was best, but Emily couldn't help feeling betrayed. As the hours passed and the night deepened, Emily's mind raced. The thought of being forced into a life she didn't choose gnawed at her. She thought of the dreams she had tucked away, the recipes scribbled in notebooks under her bed, the visions of owning her own cafe one day. Those dreams felt so distant now, like the faint glimmer of a star on a cloudy night. She finally stood, her movements slow but deliberate. Margaret, who had dozed off on the couch, stirred slightly, but didn't wake. Emily looked at her mother, her expression softening. She leaned down and pressed a kiss to Margaret's forehead. "I love you, Mom," she whispered, "but I can't do this." Emily moved quietly through the house, gathering a small backpack with a few essentials, her favorite notebook, a change of clothes, and a photo of her and her father from happier times. She slipped on her worn sneakers and pulled on her coat. Standing by the front door, she hesitated for a moment. Her heart ached, torn between guilt and the overwhelming need to escape. But then she thought of Richard's smug face, the way he had smirked when he said, "Don't worry, Emily, I'll take good care of you." That was all the push she needed. She stepped out into the night, the cold air biting at her skin. The town was eerily quiet, the streets deserted. Her heart pounded as she walked, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she couldn't stay. The stars above seemed to shimmer brighter as she reached the edge of town, where the main road stretched out like a lifeline. She stood there, the weight of her decision sinking in. This was it, her first step toward freedom, toward a life of her own choosing. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, growing brighter as the car approached. Emily stepped onto the road, her hand raised, her heart racing. She didn't know who was behind the wheel, but she didn't care. All she knew was that she was leaving Willow Ridge behind, and she wasn't looking back. The sleek hum of an engine filled the empty road as the car's headlights grew brighter, piercing the darkness. Emily stood frozen in the middle of the street, her heart pounding in her chest. Her outstretched hand trembled, though she tried to steady herself. The car slowed as it approached her, its tires crunching against the gravel shoulder. The vehicle was a luxurious black coupe, its polished exterior reflecting the faint light of the stars above. For a moment, Emily hesitated. She could feel her chest tighten with a mixture of fear and determination. Was this reckless? Could she trust whoever was behind the wheel? But the thought of Richard's smug smile, the way he had leered at her like she was a possession to be acquired, pushed her forward. The driver's side window rolled down smoothly, revealing a man with tousled dark hair and a sharp, angular face. His piercing blue eyes locked onto Emily with a mixture of curiosity and caution. He couldn't have been much older than 30, but there was something about him, an air of experience, of weariness, that made him seem older. "What are you doing out here at this hour?" the man asked, his voice deep and steady, though it carried a hint of suspicion. Emily swallowed hard, forcing herself to stand tall. "I need a ride," she said, trying to keep her voice even. "Just to New Orleans." The man raised an eyebrow, leaning slightly out of the window. His gaze swept over her, a quick but thorough assessment. Her backpack, the worn sneakers, the pale skin of someone who had been under immense stress. "New Orleans?" he repeated, his tone skeptical. "That's a long way from here. What's a girl like you doing out on the road in the middle of the night?" Emily clenched her fists, feeling the weight of his scrutiny. She didn't owe him an explanation, but she knew she needed his help. "I'm not running away," she said quickly, though the words felt hollow even as they left her lips. I just need to get to the city. Please." The man studied her for another long moment, his jaw tightening. The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Emily could feel her cheeks flush under his gaze, her composure threatening to crack. Finally he sighed and pushed the passenger door open. "Get in," he said simply. Emily hesitated only for a moment before climbing into the car. The leather seats were cold against her skin, and the faint scent of expensive cologne lingered in the air. She glanced at the man as he shifted the car into drive, his movements deliberate and practiced. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't respond immediately, his eyes focused on the road ahead. The car moved smoothly, the hum of the engine the only sound filling the space between them. After a few minutes he glanced at her sideways. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone casual but probing. "Emily," she replied. She hesitated before adding, "Emily Harper." The man nodded but didn't offer his name in return. Instead, he kept his eyes on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel firmly. The silence stretched on, growing heavier with each passing mile. Emily shifted in her seat, clutching her backpack tightly. The questions swirling in her mind threatened to overwhelm her. Who was this man? Why had he stopped for her? And most importantly, was she safe? She risked a glance at him again, taking in the sharp lines of his profile. His jaw was set, his expression unreadable. The dim glow of the dashboard lights cast shadows across his face, highlighting the faint scar along his left cheekbone. He was handsome, undeniably so, but there was something guarded about him, something that made her wary. "Thank you," she said again, her voice louder this time. She needed to break the silence, to fill the void between them with something other than her racing thoughts. "For what?" he asked, not looking at her. "For stopping," she said simply. Most people wouldn't. He let out a short, humorless laugh. Most people don't pick up strangers in the middle of the night, he said, especially ones who look like they're running from something. Emily felt her cheeks burn, but she didn't respond. He wasn't wrong after all. The man sighed and glanced at her again, his expression softening slightly. "Look, I'm not trying to pry," he said, "but if you're in trouble, if someone's after you—" "No one's after me," Emily said quickly, cutting him off. Her voice was firm, but the slight tremor betrayed her. "I'm fine." He didn't look convinced, but he didn't press the issue. Instead, he turned his attention back to the road, the tension between them settling into an uneasy truce. As the car sped down the dark highway, Emily leaned her head against the window, the cool glass soothing against her skin. For the first time in what felt like hours, she allowed herself to breathe. She didn't know where this road would take her or what awaited her in New Orleans. But for now, she was free. And for Emily Harper, that was enough. The car moved through the darkness like a whisper, its headlights slicing through the seemingly endless stretch of empty road. Emily sat stiffly in the passenger seat, her hands clutching the straps of her backpack so tightly her knuckles turned white. The tension inside the car was palpable, like an overfilled balloon ready to burst at the slightest touch. The driver, still a mystery to her, kept his focus on the road ahead. His silence was deafening, and every few minutes Emily caught herself stealing glances at him. His jaw was clenched, his hands gripping the steering wheel with an intensity that suggested he was deep in thought or perhaps on edge. Finally, unable to bear the oppressive quiet, Emily broke the silence. "Where are you heading?" she asked, her voice barely rising above the hum of the engine. The man didn't look at her. "Does it matter?" he replied coolly. Emily flinched at the sharpness of his tone. "I guess not," she muttered, turning her gaze out the window. The world outside was a blur of shadowy trees and distant lights, the landscape foreign and unfamiliar. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The rhythmic sound of the tires on the pavement should have been soothing, but it only amplified the storm brewing in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had jumped into a situation far beyond her control. "What's in New Orleans?" the man asked suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was calm now, almost casual, but there was an edge to it, a curiosity that seemed more like suspicion. Emily hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "A new beginning," she said finally. He glanced at her briefly, his eyes narrowing. "That's vague," Emily sighed, leaning back in her seat. "Look, I don't owe you my life story," she snapped. "You asked me if I needed a ride, and I said yes. That's it." The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he tapped his fingers against the steering wheel, his expression unreadable. "Fair enough," he said at last. "But if you think I'm going to drop you off in the middle of New Orleans without knowing a thing about you, you're mistaken." Emily felt a surge of frustration rise in her chest. "Why do you care?" she demanded. For the first time, he looked directly at her. His blue eyes were piercing, filled with something she couldn't quite place, anger, perhaps, or maybe something softer, like concern. "Because I've seen what happens to people who run without a plan," he said, his voice low but firm, "and it's never good." Emily's breath caught in her throat. There was something in his tone, something raw and genuine that made her pause. She wanted to argue, to tell him he didn't know her or her circumstances, but the words died on her lips. Before she could respond, the car jerked slightly as they hit a pothole. Emily gripped the edge of her seat, her heart racing. "Road's worse than I thought," the man muttered, his hands steadying the wheel. The tension in the car only seemed to grow as they continued down the dark, winding road. Emily couldn't help but feel trapped, not just in the car, but in her own life. She had escaped one prison only to find herself in another, and the weight of it all was suffocating. "I'm sorry," she said suddenly, surprising even herself. The man raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For snapping at you," Emily admitted, her voice soft. I'm not used to relying on anyone." The man's expression softened slightly, though his grip on the wheel remained firm. "It's fine," he said. "I get it." For a moment, The two of them sat in silence, the tension easing just a fraction. Then, out of nowhere, the car's engine sputtered and coughed, the smooth hum faltering. "What the—" the man muttered, his eyes darting to the dashboard. The warning lights flickered on, casting an eerie red glow across the interior. "Is something wrong?" Emily asked, her voice tinged with panic. "Yeah," he said grimly, pulling the car over to the side of the road. The vehicle came to a halt with a shudder, the engine falling silent. The man unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out of the car, muttering under his breath. Emily followed hesitantly, the cold night air biting at her skin. "Do you know what's wrong?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He crouched by the hood, his hands moving expertly as he inspected the engine. "It's overheating," he said after a moment. "Something's off with the coolant system." Emily wrapped her arms around herself, her eyes scanning the empty road. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. They were stranded. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans. "There's a gas station a few miles back," he said. "We'll have to walk." Emily's stomach sank. The thought of walking miles in the dead of night with a complete stranger was far from ideal, but what choice did she have? "Let's go," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Emily hesitated but nodded, pulling her backpack tighter against her shoulders. As they set off down the dark road, the silence between them was heavier than ever. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist around them, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Every rustle of leaves, every distant sound, made Emily's heart race. She kept glancing at the man beside her, his tall, broad-shouldered figure moving confidently through the night. For the first time, she allowed herself to wonder who he really was. There was something about him, something enigmatic and unsettling, that she couldn't quite put her finger on. And as they walked, the weight of the night seemed to grow heavier, the air thick with unspoken words and unanswered questions. The chill of the night pressed in around them as Emily and Alex walked side by side along the desolate highway. The moon hung high, casting a silvery glow over the asphalt and the trees that lined the road. Every step Emily took felt heavier than the last, her legs growing tired, but she refused to complain. She had chosen this path, and she wouldn't show weakness now. Alex walked a pace ahead, his long stride steady and confident. His silhouette seemed almost larger than life in the moonlight, but his silence was oppressive. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he wasn't saying, something he was holding back. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the stillness, mingling with the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant cry of an owl. Emily hugged her arms around herself, her thin jacket doing little to keep out the biting cold. "You're quiet," Alex said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was low, almost cautious, as if he were testing the waters. Emily glanced at him, surprised. "I could say the same about you," she replied. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Fair enough." They fell into silence again. But this time it felt different, less like a wall between them and more like a shared understanding. After a few more minutes, Alex slowed his pace, falling into step beside her. "You sure about New Orleans?" he asked, his tone more curious than skeptical. Emily hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "It's the only place I can think of," she said finally. "I've never been, but it feels far enough away. A place where I can start over." Alex raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. "You don't have anyone waiting for you there?" "No," Emily said softly. "Just a hope that things will be better." Alex nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes hope's all you need." His words caught her off guard. For a moment, she looked at him, trying to read his face. There was a shadow there, a weight he carried that mirrored her own. She wanted to ask him about it, to understand the man who had stopped for her on that dark road, but she held back. "Do you know New Orleans well?" she asked instead, hoping to keep the conversation going. "Well enough," Alex replied. "It's a city of second chances if you're willing to fight for them." His words hung in the air, resonating with Emily in a way she hadn't expected. They continued walking, the gas station still miles away. The road seemed endless, the dark stretching out before them like a void. Emily's thoughts began to wander, drifting back to Willow Ridge, to the life she had left behind. Her mother's face flashed in her mind, tired, lined with worry, but filled with love. Guilt gnawed at her as she thought of Margaret sitting alone in their small house, wondering where she had gone. Emily had left a note, but she knew it wasn't enough. She had chosen her own freedom over her mother's security, and the weight of that decision was almost unbearable. "Do you regret it?" Alex's voice cut through her thoughts, startling her. Emily blinked, looking at him. "What?" "Leaving," he said simply. For a moment, Emily didn't know how to answer. "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe I will tomorrow, or the next day. But right now, all I feel is relief." Alex nodded as if he understood. "Sometimes it's the only choice you have," he said quietly. Emily wanted to ask him what he meant, but before she could, a distant sound caught her attention. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew louder with each passing second, the unmistakable rumble of an engine. She turned, her heart racing as she saw a pair of headlights approaching from behind. "Stay back," Alex said sharply, stepping in front of her. Emily obeyed, her breath catching in her throat as the car slowed. It was an old pickup truck, its paint chipped and rusted. The driver rolled down the window, revealing a grizzled man with a weathered face and a cigarette dangling from his lips. "You two lost?" the man asked, his voice rough. Alex's stance didn't relax. "Car broke down," he said shortly. "We're heading to the gas station." The man squinted at them, his gaze lingering on Emily for a moment too long. She felt a chill run down her spine and instinctively moved closer to Alex. "Long way to walk," the man said, blowing out a puff of smoke. "You need a ride?" Emily glanced at Alex, unsure. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he studied the man. "We're fine," Alex said firmly. The man shrugged, but there was something about his expression that made Emily uneasy. "Suit yourself," he said, his voice laced with something she couldn't quite place, mockery perhaps, or malice. The truck roared back to life, and the man drove off, leaving a trail of exhaust in his wake. As the taillights disappeared into the distance, Emily let out a shaky breath. "Why didn't we take the ride?" she asked, her voice trembling. Alex turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Sometimes it's safer to keep walking," he said. Emily nodded, though her unease remained. They continued down the road, the silence between them now charged with tension. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the shadows around them weren't as empty as they seemed. She glanced at Alex, his figure strong and steady beside her, and felt a flicker of reassurance. Whatever lay ahead, she wasn't facing it alone. The pickup truck's engine faded into the distance, swallowed by the vast silence of the road. Emily couldn't help but glance over her shoulder, half expecting to see the faint glow of its taillights reappear. The man's lingering gaze stayed with her, gnawing at her nerves. Alex walked ahead, his shoulders tense, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets. The shadows of the trees cast fleeting patterns over the pavement, shifting with each step they took. Emily quickened her pace to catch up with him, her breathing shallow. "You didn't trust him," she said, her voice soft but probing. Alex didn't break his stride. "Should I have?" Emily hesitated, biting her lip. He seemed like he wanted to help. Alex stopped abruptly, turning to face her. His piercing blue eyes caught hers, glinting in the dim moonlight. "And if he didn't?" he asked, his tone calm but pointed. "You have to be smarter than that, Emily. Not everyone who offers help has good intentions." His words stung, but she knew he was right. The man's gaze had unsettled her, and Alex's instincts felt more trustworthy than her own. She nodded silently, and Alex resumed walking, his pace steady but brisk. The cold bit at Emily's exposed skin, her thin jacket doing little to shield her from the elements. She pulled it tighter around her, shivering as the wind picked up. The road seemed endless, stretching out like a dark ribbon under the faint glow of the moon. "Are we close?" she asked after a long silence, her voice trembling from both the cold and her unease. Alex glanced at her, his expression softening slightly. "Another mile, maybe 2, he said. Emily sighed, her exhaustion creeping into every muscle. "Feels like we've been walking forever." "Keep moving," Alex said. "The sooner we get there, the sooner we figure out our next step." His words were practical, but Emily could sense the underlying tension in his tone. Something was bothering him, something more than their current predicament. They walked on, the silence stretching once again. The rhythmic sound of their footsteps became a steady companion, punctuated only by the occasional rustle of leaves or distant hoot of an owl. Emily's mind wandered, drifting back to the life she had left behind. "What about you?" she asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. Alex glanced at her, his brow furrowing slightly. "What about me?" "Why were you out there tonight?" she asked, her curiosity outweighing her hesitation. "On that road, I mean." For a moment, Alex didn't respond. His gaze shifted to the horizon, his jaw tightening. "Just needed to clear my head," he said finally. His tone clipped. Emily frowned, sensing there was more to the story. "That's it?" Alex stopped walking, turning to face her again. His expression was guarded, but there was a flicker of something vulnerable in his eyes. "Sometimes it's easier to drive than to sit still and think," he said. "That's all." Emily wanted to press further, to dig deeper into the enigmatic man who had become her unlikely companion, but something in his tone warned her not to push. She nodded and continued walking, her thoughts racing. The trees lining the road grew denser as they moved further away from the open highway. The darkness felt heavier here, the shadows deeper and more oppressive. Emily's unease returned, her eyes darting to the edges of the road. "Do you think that guy will come back?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alex didn't answer immediately, his gaze scanning the road ahead. "If he does, I'll handle it," he said simply. His confidence was reassuring, but Emily couldn't shake the knot of fear in her chest. They rounded a bend in the road, and a faint light appeared in the distance, a flickering neon sign that marked the gas station. Relief washed over Emily, her steps quickening. "We're almost there," she said, her voice tinged with hope. "Don't get too excited," Alex said, his tone cautious. "We don't know what kind of place this is yet." As they approached, the details of the gas station came into focus. It was small and run down, the paint peeling from its walls. The neon sign buzzed faintly, casting an eerie glow over the empty lot. A single car was parked by the pumps, its windows dark. Alex stopped a few feet from the entrance, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "Stay close," he said, his voice low. Emily nodded, her heart pounding as they stepped onto the cracked pavement. The door to the gas station swung open with a creak, and a man emerged. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a scruffy beard and a cigarette dangling from his lips. "Evening," the man said, his voice gruff. His eyes flicked between Alex and Emily, lingering on her for a moment too long. "Evening," Alex replied, his tone steady but firm. "Car broke down a few miles back. We're looking for coolant." The man nodded, gesturing toward the small convenience store attached to the station. "Inside," he said. "You'll find what you need." Alex led the way, his body tense, his movements deliberate. Emily followed closely, her eyes darting around the dimly lit store. The shelves were sparsely stocked, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and motor oil. As Alex searched for the coolant, Emily lingered near the counter, her eyes on the man outside. He was leaning against the car now, his gaze fixed on the station door. "You find it?" she asked, her voice tight. "Got it," Alex replied, holding up a dusty bottle. He paid quickly, his movements brisk, and they stepped back out into the cold night air. The man didn't move as they passed, but Emily felt his eyes on her, sending a shiver down her spine. "Let's go," Alex said, his tone leaving no room for argument. They set off down the road again, the gas station fading into the distance behind them. Emily's heart was still racing, her unease growing with each step. "Do you think he'll follow us?" she asked, glancing over her shoulder. Alex didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "If he does, he'll regret it," he said, his voice low and firm. Emily wanted to believe him, but the darkness around them felt more suffocating than ever. The road stretched endlessly before them, its dark surface glimmering faintly under the pale light of the moon. The cold wind swept through the trees, carrying with it a faint, eerie whistle that made Emily pull her jacket tighter around herself. The air felt heavier now, as though something unseen lingered just out of reach. Alex walked beside her, his every step purposeful and steady. His broad shoulders were tense, his jaw clenched. The bottle of coolant swung loosely in his hand, but there was nothing relaxed about his demeanor. Emily couldn't help but steal glances at him, trying to decipher the thoughts that seemed to weigh him down. "Do you think," she began hesitantly, her voice barely rising above the sound of their footsteps, "do you think that man back at the gas station was watching us?" Alex didn't respond immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the road ahead, scanning the horizon as though expecting something to appear. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but tinged with an edge of warning. "It doesn't matter what he was doing," he said. "We're not going back." Emily nodded, though her unease lingered. She cast another glance over her shoulder, her breath hitching as she thought she saw movement in the shadows. But when she squinted, there was nothing there, just the shifting of the trees in the wind. "Do you think he followed us?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Alex stopped walking, turning to face her. His piercing blue eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment she forgot how to breathe. "If he did," Alex said, his voice steady and firm, "he'll regret it." There was something in the way he said it, a quiet confidence that both reassured and unnerved her. Emily nodded again, her grip on her backpack tightening. They continued walking, the silence between them growing heavier with each step. Emily tried to focus on the road, to push away the nagging fear that clawed at the edges of her mind, but the darkness around them felt oppressive. Suddenly, Alex stopped. His body went rigid, his eyes narrowing as he stared into the distance. "What is it?" Emily whispered, her heart pounding. Alex didn't answer. Instead, he raised a hand, motioning for her to stay quiet. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat as she strained to see what had caught his attention. Far down the road, barely visible in the faint light, was a pair of headlights. They were distant, but they were moving slowly, steadily toward them. Emily's chest tightened. "Do you think it's him?" she whispered. "Maybe," Alex replied, his voice low. He glanced around, his eyes scanning the sides of the road. "Come on." He grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the trees. Emily stumbled after him, her heart racing as they moved off the road and into the shadows. The ground beneath her feet was uneven, the thick layer of fallen leaves muffling their movements. Alex led her deeper into the trees, his grip on her hand firm and unyielding. They crouched behind a large oak, the rough bark pressing against Emily's back as she tried to catch her breath. The headlights grew brighter, the low rumble of the engine becoming audible. Emily's pulse thundered in her ears as she clung to her backpack, her eyes fixed on the road. The car slowed as it approached the spot where they had been walking. Emily held her breath, her body tense as the vehicle came to a stop. The driver's side door opened and a figure stepped out. Even in the dim light, Emily could make out the unmistakable silhouette of the man from the gas station. Her heart sank. The man walked slowly around the car, a flashlight in his hand. The beam of light swept over the road and the trees, coming dangerously close to their hiding spot. "What does he want?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. Alex didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the man, his body coiled like a spring ready to snap. The man muttered something under his breath, his flashlight moving back and forth as he scanned the area. After a few tense moments, he climbed back into the car and drove off, the headlights disappearing into the distance. Emily let out a shaky breath, her entire body trembling. "Why was he following us?" she asked, her voice quivering. Alex stood, offering her a hand. "I don't know," he said, "but we're not sticking around to find out." Emily took his hand, her legs unsteady as she got to her feet. She followed him back to the road, her mind racing. The rest of their walk was tense, the silence between them heavier than ever. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the man would come back, that they were being watched. When they finally reached the car, Emily felt a surge of relief. Alex set the bottle of coolant on the hood, his movements quick and precise as he worked on the engine. "Will it work?" Emily asked, her voice still shaky. "It'll get us moving," Alex replied, his tone clipped. Emily watched him work, her nerves still frayed. She wanted to ask him more, to understand what had just happened, but the look on his face stopped her. Finally, Alex closed the hood and climbed into the driver's seat. Emily followed, clutching her backpack tightly as the car rumbled to life. As they pulled back onto the road, Emily glanced out the window, her eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of the man. "Do you think he'll come after us again?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alex's hands tightened on the wheel. "If he does, he won't get far," he said. There was a finality in his tone that sent a chill down her spine. Emily leaned back in her seat, her eyes closing as exhaustion finally caught up with her. But even as sleep began to pull at her, the image of the man's flashlight sweeping through the trees stayed with her, a reminder that their journey was far from over. The car's engine hummed steadily as Alex guided it back onto the empty road. Emily sat in the passenger seat, her body tense despite the growing distance between them and the man from the gas station. Her fingers fiddled with the strap of her backpack, her mind racing with questions she didn't know how to ask. The night outside seemed darker than before, the faint light of the moon obscured by thick clouds. The shadows of the trees flanking the road felt more menacing, their shapes twisting with the car's movement. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't safe, that the headlights in the rear-view mirror could reappear at any moment. Alex drove in silence, his grip on the steering wheel tight, his knuckles pale. His jaw was set, and the faint crease between his brows deepened with every passing mile. Emily glanced at him, her curiosity mingled with fear. He hadn't said much since they left the gas station, but the tension radiating from him was palpable. Finally, she couldn't take it any more. "Alex," she said softly, her voice breaking the heavy silence. He didn't look at her. "What? Who do you think he was?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Alex's lips pressed into a thin line. "Does it matter?" he replied, his tone clipped. Emily frowned, frustration bubbling to the surface. "It matters to me," she said. "That man was following us. He stopped on the road, got out of his car and looked for us. I think I deserve to know what you think." Alex sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly. He glanced at her briefly before turning his attention back to the road. "Maybe he was just curious," he said finally. "Or maybe he thought we were easy targets." "Targets?" Emily's voice rose slightly, a mixture of fear and disbelief. "People like him, they look for vulnerabilities," Alex said. "A young woman on the road at night, a broken-down car. It wouldn't take much for him to think we were easy to take advantage of." The words sent a shiver down Emily's spine. She hugged her backpack tighter, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. "But we're not vulnerable," Alex added, his voice firm. "Not while I'm here." Emily looked at him, surprised by the conviction in his tone. She wanted to believe him, to feel reassured, but the tension in the air refused to dissipate. They drove in silence for a while, the road ahead stretching endlessly into the night. Emily's eyelids grew heavy, the exhaustion of the night finally catching up with her. She leaned her head against the window, the cool glass soothing against her skin. Just as she was about to drift off, the car jolted suddenly. Emily's eyes snapped open, her heart racing. "What was that?" she asked, panic creeping into her voice. Alex frowned, slowing the car. "A bump in the road maybe," he said, though his voice lacked certainty. The car continued to slow, the engine sputtering slightly. Alex's grip on the wheel tightened, his jaw clenching as he pulled the car to the side of the road. "Stay here," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Emily watched as he climbed out of the car, her nerves on edge. She could see his figure in the dim light, crouching near the front of the vehicle. The sound of the engine ticking as it cooled filled the silence, each click echoing in the stillness. She glanced around nervously, her eyes scanning the darkness. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches swaying slightly in the wind. Her breath hitched as she thought she saw movement in the shadows, but when she blinked, there was nothing there. A sharp knock on the window made her jump. She turned to see Alex standing there, his expression grim. "What is it?" she asked as she rolled down the window. "The tire's blown," he said. "We'll have to change it." Emily's stomach sank. "Here? Now, unless you'd prefer to walk again," Alex said, his voice tinged with sarcasm. Emily climbed out of the car reluctantly, the cold night air biting at her skin. Alex opened the trunk, pulling out the spare tire and tools. "Hold this," he said, handing her the flashlight. Emily took it, the weight of it solid and reassuring in her hand. She watched as Alex worked, his movements quick and efficient. Despite the tension of the situation, there was something calming about his focus, the way he seemed completely in control. But that sense of calm shattered when the sound of an approaching engine reached their ears. Emily froze, her grip on the flashlight tightening. She turned to Alex, her eyes wide with fear. "Get in the car," he said sharply, his voice low. "What about you?" she asked, panic rising in her chest. "Get in the car." Emily obeyed, climbing into the passenger seat and locking the door. She watched as Alex stood by the car, his body tense, his eyes fixed on the approaching vehicle. The headlights grew brighter, the low rumble of the engine filling the air. Emily's heart raced as the car slowed, coming to a stop a few feet away from them. The driver's door opened, and a figure stepped out. Even in the dim light, Emily recognized him, the man from the gas station. He stood there for a moment, his hands in his pockets, his posture casual. But there was something predatory about the way he moved, like a cat stalking its prey. "Well, well," the man said, his voice carrying over the silence. "Fancy meeting you here." Emily's stomach churned as Alex stepped forward, his body blocking her view of the man. "What do you want?" Alex asked, his voice cold and steady. The man shrugged, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "Just thought I'd check on you, make sure you didn't need any help." "We're fine," Alex said firmly. "You can move along." The man didn't move. Instead, he tilted his head, his eyes shifting toward the car. Emily ducked down instinctively, her heart pounding in her chest. "Pretty girl you've got there," the man said, his tone mocking. "Be a shame if something happened to her." Alex's posture stiffened, his fists clenching at his sides. "Leave, now." The man chuckled, the sound low and menacing. "You've got some nerve, kid," he said. "But let's see how far that gets you." The tension was unbearable, the air between them crackling like a live wire. Emily's breath came in shallow gasps as she watched from the car, her fear threatening to consume her. And then, without warning, Alex lunged. Chapter 8. Through shadows, into light. The moment Alex lunged, the world seemed to slow. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she watched him move with precision and purpose, his body coiled like a spring. The man from the gas station barely had time to react before Alex's fist connected with his jaw, the sickening crack reverberating through the cold night air. The man stumbled back, clutching his face, but the smirk didn't leave his lips. If anything, it grew wider, twisted with malice. "Big mistake, kid," he growled, wiping blood from his mouth. "Stay down," Alex said, his voice low and menacing. He stood firm, his posture steady, every muscle in his body tense. But the man didn't stay down. Instead, he straightened, his hand slipping into his jacket. Emily's heart dropped as she saw the glint of something metallic in the faint light. "Alex!" she screamed, her voice breaking through the night like a siren. Alex moved quickly, faster than Emily thought possible. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it sharply. The metallic object, a knife, clattered to the ground. The man cried out in pain, but Alex didn't let go. "Don't even think about it," Alex hissed, his voice cold and dangerous. The man glared at him, his eyes filled with fury. "You don't know who you're messing with," he spat. "And I don't care," Alex replied. He shoved the man backward, sending him sprawling onto the ground. Emily, still in the car, gripped the edge of her seat so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her entire body was trembling, her mind racing. She wanted to do something, anything, but fear held her in place. The man struggled to his feet, his movements slower now, more deliberate. He glanced between Alex and the knife on the ground, calculating his next move. "Walk away," Alex said, his voice firm and commanding. "Now." For a moment, the man hesitated. Then, with a sneer, he raised his hands in mock surrender. "Fine," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You win this round." He backed toward his car, his eyes never leaving Alex. "But you'd better watch your back," he added, his smirk returning. "Both of you." With that, he climbed into his car, slamming the door shut. The engine roared to life, and the vehicle sped off, its headlights disappearing into the distance. Silence fell over the road, heavy and suffocating. Alex stood there for a moment, his shoulders rising and falling with each heavy breath. Then he turned and walked back to the car, his expression unreadable. Emily unlocked the door and opened it, stepping out to meet him. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice shaky. "I'm fine," Alex said, his tone clipped. "But your hand..." Emily reached for it, noticing the red marks on his knuckles. "It's nothing," Alex said, pulling his hand away. His gaze softened as he looked at her. "Are you okay?" Emily nodded, though her legs felt like jelly. "I was so scared," she admitted, her voice trembling. Alex placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's over," he said. "He's gone." Emily wanted to believe him, but the man's parting words echoed in her mind. "You'd better watch your back." They returned to the car, and Alex finished changing the tire in silence. Emily stayed close, her eyes darting nervously around the dark road. When they were finally back on the road, the tension between them was almost unbearable. After what felt like an eternity, Emily broke the silence. "Who are you, Alex?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. Alex glanced at her, his expression guarded. "What do you mean?" "You're not just some guy who happened to be driving down that road," she said. "The way you handled him, the way you stayed so calm, that's not normal." Alex sighed, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. For a moment, he didn't respond. Then finally he spoke. "I used to work in private security," he said. "High-profile clients, dangerous situations. You learn how to handle people like him." Emily stared at him, processing his words. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because it doesn't matter," Alex said. "That part of my life is over, is it?" Emily asked softly. Alex didn't respond, his jaw tightening. The rest of the drive passed in silence, the tension between them thick, but no longer hostile. Emily leaned her head against the window, her mind racing. She had so many questions, but she wasn't sure she wanted the answers. When the faint lights of New Orleans appeared on the horizon, Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her. They had made it. Alex pulled the car into a quiet parking lot, turning off the engine. He turned to Emily, his blue eyes meeting hers. "This is where we part ways," he said. Emily felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name, loss, perhaps, or regret. "Thank you," she said softly. Alex nodded. "Take care of yourself, Emily." She climbed out of the car, her backpack slung over her shoulder. As she stood there, watching Alex prepare to leave, a sudden realization hit her. "Wait," she said, stepping closer. "You saved me. Twice. I don't even know how to thank you properly." Alex looked at her, his expression softening. "You don't have to," he said. "Just live the life you came here for. That's thanks enough." With that, he drove off, leaving Emily standing alone in the parking lot. For a moment, she felt lost. But as she turned and looked at the city before her, the fear and uncertainty began to fade. She had made it. She was free, and for the first time in a long time, Emily Harper felt hopeful. As the sun rises over the horizon, Emily and Alex walk forward, leaving behind the shadows of the night. What began as a desperate escape turned into a journey of trust, courage, and the hope for a brighter future. Sometimes the most unexpected encounters lead us to the paths we're meant to take. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who might need a little inspiration today. And before you go, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There are many more stories waiting to be told, stories of resilience, connection, and second chances. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you in the next one.